Hi there, my name is Nick Martellaro. You may be wondering why there appears to be a Lego street behind me. Well, this is actually a hobby that I've had for a long time now, but that's not what this video is about. But I did feel like it would be pretty much the perfect backdrop for what we are going to talk about today, which is Matthew Street, or more specifically, the most famous musical venue in the world, the Cavern Club. Now, look, here's the thing. I've been working on this video for way too long, like a year at this point. And originally, it was just going to be kind of a short thing, maybe like 30 minutes, and it's literally at 3 hours at this point. So if I don't start uploading episodes, I'm pretty much never going to finish this thing. So this is the first episode. I'm going to give you the introduction, and we're pretty much going to explain why the hell I even did all this. But along the line somewhere, I probably will just dump the whole thing and put like a 3-hour version of this video. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode format. And yeah, let's just talk about the Cavern Club. Enjoy. I've got a bit of a fascination with lost history, and as it turns out, there are a lot of famous Beatles locations that are simply lost forever. And while the Beatles definitely played their fair share of dimly lit bars and basement venues during their early years, none are more associated with their pre-fame era than the Cavern Club. And for those who don't know, the Cavern Club was essentially an industrial cellar underneath a row of dilapidated Victorian warehouses on Matthew Street in Liverpool. And yet, this dingy, dark cellar changed the world. Unfortunately, this original location is gone forever. And while a replica exists just a few addresses down the street from the original club, it is not the venue that the Beatles played at. And despite what the current club claims, this place, the true mecca of Merseybeat, the best of cellars, is still buried underneath the ground. Now I'm going to level with you guys, this is without a doubt the deepest dive I have ever done. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you'll know that's saying something. If you watch this entire video, by the end of it, you're going to feel like you have walked down Matthew Street and into the original Cavern Club yourself. I'm not kidding about that. We're going to look at countless rare photos, film footage, blueprints, street maps, insurance plans, aerial captures, floor layouts, perspective drawings, old newspapers, old newsreels, street directories, hidden reservoirs, secret entrances, and we're even going to take a virtual walk down Matthew Street and observe how the location changed throughout the 1960s and beyond. And towards the end of this video, we're actually going to explore the original Cavern Club, everything from the snack bar to the bathrooms. I'm going to put the blueprints on one side and pictures and footage on the other, so you can see exactly what we're looking at as if you were standing there yourself. So as I said, I have never spent this much time researching a video, so I think it would be appropriate to start by telling you why I even came across this topic. Originally, I came up with the idea to do a fun video about 5 lost Beatles locations. I thought it was going to be easy. The Cavern Club was the first one on the list. So here are the quick facts that you need to know going in. For those of us who don't live in the UK, this is Liverpool. It should be pretty clear why it's considered a port city, because there's docks everywhere all along the River Mersey. Matthew Street, yes, with one T, is in the heart of Liverpool. Although calling it a street is kind of generous, by today's standards, it would probably qualify as an alley if it were built now, or even a service road. Despite this, this is where the original Cavern Club was located, and in the 1960s, it was in the cellar of a very old warehouse sandwiched between 2 other very old warehouses. By 1966, the club expanded into one of these neighboring warehouses, adding a new entrance to comply with safety standards. In 1973, the entire warehouse site was demolished for reasons I'll go into later, completely filled in and knocked down. They tried reopening on the other side of the street, not down the street, but literally across the road at a new location, but it just wasn't the same and it went bankrupt by 1976. In 1982, Liverpool decided to revitalize Matthew Street. The site of the demolished warehouses, which had since become a parking lot, was rebuilt into the Cavern Walks shopping center, which stands there today. A new Cavern Club was constructed and it opened in 1984, and it's the one that you can visit right now. This is what Matthew Street appears like today. I have flipped this map so that north is down, as if you were looking at the building yourself. The bordering street up top is Harrington Street. Here is what is claimed. Despite being completely different buildings, remember the original structure was demolished, the entrance to the current Cavern Club, which is right here, is supposedly at the exact same location as the entrance that was added in 1966 to comply with those safety regulations. The original entrance to the Cavern Club, before it was expanded, when the Beatles played there in that famous black and white footage, that was apparently right here. And in fact, there is currently a statue of Cilla Black, another talented Liverpool singer and Cavern Club employee, marking this spot. Today, this is used as a fire exit for the current club. Here, I'll show you. Right now, we're looking down Matthew Street. Here's the new entrance to the Cavern Club at 10 Matthew Street, at the location of the one added in 1966. We keep going forward a little bit, and here's Cilla at 8 Matthew, the original entrance. And I'll mention this now, if you follow this building to the end, there's an electrical substation here that doubles as a public art exhibit. And finally, number 3, it is claimed that the current Cavern Club overlaps 70% of the footprint of the original club. I also found this graphic made by an account known as Hidden Liverpool that was supposed to show this overlap. When I make my videos, I always make my own HD graphics, so I decided to recreate their overlay. That's when I realized that it just didn't make any sense, and I'll explain why. But as far as the Hidden Liverpool guy, I'm not criticizing him at all. In fact, I talked to him and he gave me a lot of great insight and a ton of good info. His name is Chris Cannon, and that actually sort of leads me to my next point here. Part of what captured me about this topic is that so many individuals are interested in specific nuggets of this history. It's like the Cavern Club still has this strange aura where people become locked on with different aspects of its existence. A Liverpool historian named Jim Kenny was just interested in the Victorian history of these buildings, and he's not even coming at it from a Beatles fan perspective. Chris of Hidden Liverpool was interested in lining up the entrances and comparing footprints. Ronnie of Ear Candy magazine is an architect, and he was actually interested in recreating the original floor plan for the Cavern Club. I spoke to all these people, and they were all extremely helpful in their own areas of expertise and really helped me start to put this all together and then continue the research. I think I have taken this a step further, maybe a little bit further than I should have, but I'm proud of what I've uncovered. I also used a ton of books, which I will try to put on the screen right now, but honestly, I don't think they're all going to fit. But just as an example, Spencer Lee's book about the Cavern Club gives you basically a day-to-day breakdown going back to the club's opening in 1957. And Debbie Greenberg's book, she was the daughter of one of the Cavern Club owners, wrote her story about how her family remodeled the club in 1966, adding that second entrance. As far as video footage, here are the sources that I relied on. First off, I recommend watching a documentary called The Cavern Club, The Beat Goes On. As a film, it focuses more on the individuals who made the Cavern so special over the years, and I wanted to go more into the nitty-gritty history, but I highly recommend checking it out. They show a bunch of rare film footage, and they also got access to remastered HD versions of some of the more well-known footage that we have. I also used my own sources for full versions of this footage, and I'll tell you what they were, just so if you want to research it yourself, you totally can. What I would consider the best and most comprehensive footage of Liverpool and the Cavern Club in the 1960s is a special called Liverpool A Go-Go that came out in 1965. You can watch this on YouTube, and if you're in the UK, you can even check out the HD remaster on Mubi, or use a VPN like I did and just pretend that you're a Brit. The film is particularly cool because it features Bob Wooler, who was the original announcer DJ at the Cavern Club, and for all intents, the guy that basically ran the club, despite not actually being the owner. The second is a set of British Pathé films from 1964 and 1965. And for those who don't know, British Pathé produced really spectacular color newsreels back in the day. The 1964 one is called the Merseybeat Liverpool, and it has a bunch of great color footage at the club during its heyday. The 1965 one is called And the World Listened. I'm not sure if they actually filmed them separately or if they just kind of used all the footage they got to make both of these a year apart. Both of them are just fantastic, and it's probably the best color footage that we have of the Cavern Club in its heyday. Seriously, look at this kid. He looks like he's getting ready for his day at the office or something. One source that I'm not 100% sure if they used in the new documentary, it's actually an old German film called In den Kellern von Liverpool. It's also available on YouTube, and it's got some really crazy honest footage of Liverpool that UK producers probably wouldn't have highlighted. It's also got a bunch of footage of 12-year-olds smoking cigarettes. Seriously, you can tell that this kid is a new smoker. I mean, he's just chiefing this thing. Dude, you're gonna get lightheaded. Anyway, the point is, there's a lot of obscure footage, and some of it's not easy to find. For example, Beat City, a 1963 TV special that even has Rory Storm in it. There's a great 1964 newsreel from Germany called The Beatles that also has some great footage of the Cavern Club. There's a 1964 movie called Ferry Cross the Mersey that is kind of like Jerry and the Pacemakers' version of A Hard Day's Night. It's not a good movie, but it does have a scene in the Cavern Club. There was a TV documentary from 2011 on ITV that was called I Was There When the Beatles Played the Cavern, and that actually has a lot of rare footage that I have not seen anywhere else since. The point is, there's a lot of different nuggets of Cavern Club footage, there's a hell of a lot of newsreels, and honestly, eventually, if anyone actually cares, I should probably just make a database of all the available footage. I'm also going to show you a bunch of old maps and actual historic photos of these buildings, including aerial shots from above. I obtained massive full-size scans from Historic England's Aerial Photo Explorer, as well as the National Library of Scotland's archives. I can't upload these files because they are just gigantic in size, but you can view the web versions online for free, and I'll put the link in the description. Also, I have to say this, while I can tell you that right off the bat that the 70% figure that the Cavern Club claims now is misleading, I don't want to get banned from a club that I haven't been to yet, so to be fair, the current Cavern Club isn't just pulling this figure out of thin air, and I will explain how they got here. One last thing. This is a crazy deep dive, and I'm sure I've made mistakes somewhere. So look, if you spot an error, just leave it in the comments. I'm not going to be offended, and I actually like being corrected about this kind of stuff. But the other thing I want to mention is, look, I get it. If you're from Liverpool, I understand how it must seem that some random American guy is talking about the history of your city. But look, I just want you to know that I have the utmost respect for Liverpool, and in any case, just if you have a comment, leave it in the comments below, and I would love to visit Liverpool and the Cavern Club one day. I just want you guys to know that. Just leave a comment or send me a message. I love talking to people about this stuff. So anyway, without further ado, let's talk about Matthew Street and the Cavern Club. Okay, so why was I so confused by Chris's overlay? Because after all, that's kind of what started all this. So first, he mentioned that he acquired plans of the original Cavern Club and overlaid them with the current Google Map view. Now, the plans that he's referring to are from 1972. They popped up at auction a few years back, apparently showing the club right before its demolition. This is what he used to represent the so-called footprint of the original cavern. It's not a bad idea. At the same time, Chris also knew that he needed an overlay of the current Cavern Club to make his comparison, because it's not like it takes up the entire building that's there now. That would be huge. So he smartly found these plans of the current Cavern Club dated from 2006, and he put everything on top of each other. So first, something doesn't make sense about this overlay, and it's because of these 1972 plans. By virtually every description, literally every one, the Cavern Club was one single cellar. You walk down a stone staircase on the right side of the club to get inside. It was a long, skinny room, separated by 2 rows of arches, with a stage at the end in the center, not a wide basement complex that spanned the whole street. I see a stage here, but naught else really matches this description. There are no reports of the cavern having a kitchen when the Beatles went there, and certainly not a mezzanine. I began to suspect that these plans were not giving us the whole picture. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say they were giving us too much of a picture. Based on virtually every description, like I said, it seems like the Cavern Club should have been basically a third of this. Ronnie from Ear Candy magazine is an architect who saw these same plans, and clearly he was also confused. So he contacted Debbie Greenberg, and remember, she's the daughter of the Cavern Club owner in 1966, and her family bought the club in its pre-renovated state, you could say. So she confirmed it, the center section was the original Cavern Club. That's it. The floor plan was also a lot different, but we'll get into that later because all you really need to know for now is the footprint. It's just this area right here. Next, every description of the Cavern Club's entrance, including Debbie's for that matter, indicate a doorway from the street that led to a stone staircase with a steep set of steps leading straight down until you would reach a small landing, then you would turn left, and then you would enter the club. And in fact, Debbie's rough drawing of the club as her family purchased it even shows the staircase on the right-hand side. It's the same one that you see Bob Wooler walking down right here. You go down, you turn a left, you're in the club. Now looking at Chris's map again, you can see where the problems sort of start to arise. If this is the original Cavern Club, and the original entrance was on the right side here, why doesn't it line up with Scylla? So I was determined to solve this mystery, but to do that, I needed to know everything I could possibly know about the old Matthew Street and these damn warehouses. So down the rabbit hole I went. Here are the facts. The Cavern Club originally opened as a jazz club in 1957 by Alan Sittner, who was inspired by similar French jazz clubs that had the same arched cellar vibe. When beat music proved to be more popular than jazz in Liverpool, Sittner sold the club to Ray McFall, who remained the owner from 1959 until 1966. Ray was the owner during what we would consider the club's golden era. When he went bankrupt, the club closed in 1966. It was purchased by two Liverpool businessmen, Joe Davy and Alf Gagan, and later reopened that same year. Debbie Greenberg is Alf's daughter. They owned the club until 1969. The final owner was Roy Adams, who owned the club from 1970 until its demolition. Now, throughout these four different owners, the address of the Cavern Club in the 1960s was 10 Matthew Street. However, the actual doorway to access the club was at 8 Matthew Street. These facts have been repeated over and over and over again, but no one ever really explains why the entrance to a building would be at a different address than the building itself. In fact, I'm not sure anyone ever really has dug into this, but I will later. Moving on for now, though. And by the way, when I say fact, I mean an actual fact. I'm saying that these are corroborated pieces of information that have been independently recalled by countless people. So again, you would walk in through a doorway at 8 Matthew Street, through a small passage. The doorway was set back to some extent. You could actually stand there in this passageway looking out onto the street. Then you would reach another doorway with a long flight of stairs going down, apparently 14 to be exact. You'd reach that small landing, you would turn left, and then go down a much smaller flight of stairs, reportedly 4 steps, and then you'd be in the Cavern Club. So with that in mind, I needed to familiarize myself with these plans and see if any of it lined up with these descriptions. Note that you can just about make out the address here, 6/8 Matthew Street. The Cavern should be at 10 Matthew Street. Okay, that was a little confusing, but I decided to move on for the time being. The auction also had low-quality photos, but I figured I could try to straighten out the image and remove the folds. That's when I noticed something. The auction specified 30 by 22 inch paper, which is actually an old British paper size called imperial. Not the measurement system, but it's actually the type of paper. It's called imperial size. I could not get this image to fit into a 30 by 22 canvas. The image was stretched for the auction. Using this information, though, I modified the scale and adjusted the perspective as best I could. But still, it was very difficult to read because of the quality, and it's difficult to make comparisons when you're squinting the whole time. So, I recreated the entire thing by hand. No AutoCAD here, just good old-fashioned line drawing and drafting. Now, in all fairness, there were some tiny symbols that I just could not make out, no matter how much I zoomed in. But the major features and labels should all be accurate to the original drawing, which I'll link to in the description. Now that I had a clearer picture of these plans, it was sort of easier to see what was actually going on. Ronnie from Ear Candy magazine wrote a great article a few years back when he interviewed Debbie, and she was able to clear up some of the confusion here. So these plans show the cavern after the 1966 expansions. The right section is 8 Matthew Street, the basement, and it was a recording studio known as Cavern Sound that opened in 1964, but it was later used as an expansion area for the club to add another stage and such. As I mentioned earlier, Debbie specified that the center section was the original Cavern Club, 10 Matthew Street. Lastly, the section to the left was the Mersey Bar, and that was the basement next door at 12 Matthew Street that was bricked up until 1969 when they needed more space. So to summarize, these 3 bottom sections represent the basements, and their addresses were 8, 10, and 12 Matthew Street, right to left. As for the street entrance, that's this top section here. Remember, there has to be a ground level entrance to the cellar, and this is the new entrance that was added in 1966. And it's the same location that the current Cavern Club claims that their modern entrance is situated. So now I'm going to jump in and explain a few things as if I haven't already been, but first of all, check this out here. There's a mezzanine on this ground level. The way that this drawing was done is a little bit misleading. This does not actually extend further. The dots on this mezzanine correspond to the dots here, and as you can see, it's a perfect overlap. You can start to see what's happening. In 1966, you'd enter here, underneath the mezzanine actually. And in Debbie's book, she actually has a rough perspective drawing showing what I mean, and while the layout is different here in 1966 than it was by 1972 when these plans were drawn, you can see how this mezzanine arrangement works. It's not an extended section, it's just another level. Debbie's 3D diagram essentially shows what we know about the club's layout in 1966. We're seeing the new entrance on the ground level at 6 Matthew Street, which now has an internal staircase leading to the original club marked as New Entrance to the Old Cavern. So now, you'd be entering from the back side of the club rather than directly from the street. You can see this new indoor staircase on the 1972 plans. The basement to the right of our 1972 plans, 8 Matthew Street, had not been developed yet in 1966 and is marked here as planned future extensions. It was vacant studio space. This little strip over here is all we see of 12 Matthew Street, and I'll explain when this got added later in the video, but for now, just to give you context, this is what would have all still been sealed up underground. Next, those dots themselves, they actually correspond directly to the arch support columns of the cellar below. And of course, if you overlay this top section, again, 6 Matthew Street over the basement, which again, 8 Matthew Street, you can start to get a clearer picture of how this works. Yes, the basement has a different address than the ground floor that it's attached to. Now you can start to see where problems arise with this plan. There is no entrance from the street. We can see that our famous L-shaped staircase ends abruptly, almost as if it's been sealed off. It looks like the only way of accessing it from the street is this doorway, which leads to a junction with 2 staircases? At least according to these plans, one could take a left through a doorway and it would lead to a tunnel, and then there's the staircase to the original Cavern Club. So the problem with this is, I've never heard anything about the original entrance being sealed off from the street. And if that was the case, I mean, what was everyone just remembering wrong? Perhaps the staircase was so iconic that they just forgot the first doorway? No, that didn't make any sense. Debbie specified an L-shaped staircase in her rough drawing of the original club before modifications. We can see it in a ton of videos, and Ronnie even did his own recreation drawing based on her descriptions and his own research, and that has the staircase as well. And hell, a magazine called All About History even did a 3D mock-up of the club. And although it does have quite a few inaccuracies that I'll go into later, it does give you the general vibe of the layout, and even this has the staircase leading directly from the street. So if you want more proof, you can even see in photos that this staircase led straight down, right from the street, without any weird turns. So what the hell is going on with these plans? Regardless, I started tinkering with my own overlays anyway, and that's when I sort of realized, wait, who's to say where these buildings even were? I mean, this entire complex wasn't even here yet, and we're just assuming that this aligns nicely within the borders of this building. What if the warehouses were shifted left? What if they were set back? How much of this block was actually demolished? Were there buildings to the left and right? All of this would change where the actual entrance was, and how much the current club is shared with the original. The only real way to answer these questions was to find out exactly what these warehouses really looked like and where they stood when they really existed. And to do that, I had to dig a lot deeper. So why was this legendary cellar demolished? Why was the cavern even in the cellar of a warehouse? And what did Matthew Street look like in the 1960s and before? A Liverpool historian by the name of Jim Kenny wrote a really fascinating article on the history of Matthew Street, and I'll share a link to his research below. Put simply though, that block has a ton of history, some of it pretty upsetting. In the 1800s, there were quite a few sugar houses in the area. As a result, it's likely that this area had ties to the slave trade. Some have even speculated that the vaulted caverns and similar buildings were once used as living quarters. That being said, it's probably not the case here because we know quite a bit about the history of these buildings, and I recommend you check out Jim's article. By 1816, this guy owned a sugar refinery at this same location on Matthew Street, where the Cavern Club would eventually be someday. His name was Peter Brinker, And unfortunately, he did have big ties to the slave trade. And I'm not talking like he owned a slave or something, which would be bad enough. This guy literally was a slave ship captain, owned a fleet of slave ships, multiple plantations, at least 50 slaves of his own, and even went to Parliament as a representative to, you guessed it, oppose the abolition of slavery. And according to newspapers at the time, he was instrumental in doing so. So 200 years later, this is his legacy. Anyhow, this giant sugar refinery he owned burnt to the ground in December 1843. Industrial work was super dangerous back then, and it's not like they had OSHA or any workplace regulations, so sadly there were casualties. The newspaper reports from this time are just absolutely brutal. I mean, it says here that this one guy tried to shimmy down a water pipe while the building was burning, so the water in the pipe was boiling hot. And of course, because he had to go like 7 stories down, by the time he got to the street, the skin on his hands was completely melted off. Oh my god. After about a week or so, when the newspaper reports started finalizing the death count, it looked like there were about 10 people, maybe more, that died. Business was doing well though. Peter Branker had already died at this point, so Thomas and James Branker had taken over the family company, and in 1844 they erected a bunch of new warehouses on this site, this time using claimed fireproof materials. They named them the Phoenix Warehouses, a reference to the mythological bird that rises from the ashes. A bit on the nose, don't you think? Either way, these warehouses from 1844, these fireproof warehouses, are the buildings that the Cavern Club was in. I would guess that that's why they were made of stone and iron. It was probably to satisfy the people in the community who were really mad that the previous building burnt down and killed people. But what did these new warehouses actually look like? So here was my first piece of evidence. You can see them here on this fire insurance map from several decades later in 1888. This map was actually produced by Charles Goad, a respected cartographer who made extremely accurate scale drawings throughout Canada and the UK for fire insurance purposes. Now, we're primarily going to be focusing on this section, or more specifically, we're going to be looking at the Branker warehouses, although I will mention these neighboring buildings from time to time. And while these maps aren't satellite-level perfect by today's standards, understand that most maps in this era were only rough outlines of city blocks, and didn't even come close to Goad's level of detail. I'll be referencing these fire maps a lot, and last thing, note that I've flipped this to show you how it would look as if you were entering the building yourself, so north is facing down. Really, these were 3 giant warehouses that span the entire block from Matthew Street all the way to Harrington Street. They were technically split into 6 individual warehouses, and originally, Harrington Street would have presumably been considered the front of the buildings. The entrance to the Cavern Club would have been right here, along the right side of this center building. Let me point out a couple things about this Goad fire map. So part of what makes these so special is that they use a special set of symbols to show details about a building's fire resistance. They're really quite fascinating, and they tell us a ton of information about the layout. This particular set of maps is actually from 1888, as I said, and they are freely available. I'll post the link in the description. So these circles tell us that the building had a slate roof, and while these buildings are often reported as being 6 stories or more by people who remember them, they probably felt a lot taller than they actually were, because we can see right here on the fire map, they were 3 stories with 1 basement each. These things in the front are iron loading doors that span the entire height of the building, an old way of raising cargo up before floors had elevators. I'll talk more about this later. These broken circle symbols are connections. They tell us where doors are on specific floors. We can actually see that these warehouses were built to connect all the way through to the opposite side at Harrington Street. Curiously, we can spot a stone staircase on the opposite end of the building on Harrington Street, but the staircase that would be at the Cavern Club is not shown here yet in 1888. I can only assume that at this time, the only way of entering this cellar would have been through doorways of the neighboring cellars. These dotted lines indicate a passage under, meaning that the wall beneath continued straight. In other words, these basements themselves would have been more rectangular and without these pronounced recessions. Notice that over here, it indicates that this building had a dividing wall above the ground floor that sort of split this into 2. Note that the warehouses are roughly rectangular, with the edge warehouse taking on a trapezoidal configuration likely to fit within the property line. There is a small gap behind this building, as if it's been cut off for some reason. Finally, a small alley appears to exist along the left side of this warehouse complex. And you guys probably know me, on my search for evidence, I discovered that this fire map was actually updated in 1935 to reflect changes to the buildings. And unfortunately, this updated fire map is just not available online. So I contacted the Goad folks, and after a bit of back and forth, they agreed to send me a scan of the 1935 section. Thanks, Lori. So here it is. The major difference that I'll point out for now is that we can see that the stone staircases are now labeled here and here. The entrance to the Cavern Club would have been here, but this at least confirms that street entrances could indeed be added and removed over the years. Also of interest is this section, which indicates a raised floor, almost like a random tower that is one story higher than the rest of the building. Bizarre, but I'll explain it later. I realize that it's a little bit difficult to envision what these buildings actually looked like themselves, so I'm going to show you a preview. This is a perspective drawing that I created. It's not perfectly to scale, and in real life these buildings would have been a lot longer to span all the way from Matthew Street to Harrington Street. 3 of these giant buildings were right next to each other. Here are those giant loading doors that I was talking about. While it may seem curious that these seemingly open up to nowhere, this is a common feature that you'll spot on many old buildings. Originally, there would have been a winch up here. They would actually hoist cargo right off the street. Then, some poor bloke would be tasked with pulling up the pallet through an open doorway several stories up. Needless to say, this was extremely dangerous, and I suppose that it's not something that we really think about much in today's age, but I mean, they had to get stuff upstairs somehow before freight elevators, right? Here's a totally different warehouse in London, I believe, back in the day, showing how this system sort of worked. Now you're also probably thinking, what if the rope broke? Wouldn't the cargo just crush whoever was walking by on the street below? And the answer is, yes. Yes, it would. And I assume that that's why these warehouses were designed with this recession here. It at least offsets the load slightly so that it's further away from the sidewalk and less likely to turn an unsuspecting pedestrian into a pancake. Just to cover all our bases, here's 1864, shortly after they were built. There's no addresses here, but it does show that at one time, these warehouses were certainly connected and were considered to be 3 giant buildings. I couldn't tell you what the addresses were back then, but let's move back to the fire map for a moment. The last detail I'd like to point out here, notice the addresses. At this point, by 1888, these warehouses were labeled Brankers A through F. You'll notice that this right warehouse, which should logically be 6 Matthew Street, doesn't have its own address. It's shared with the middle building, 8 Matthew Street, where the entrance to the Cavern Club would be. This is our first clue to solving this address confusion. At the minimum, though, we can see that this center building, where the entrance to the cavern was, is without a doubt located at 8 Matthew Street. I suspected that these buildings were repurposed and split up so many times over the years that the addresses simply changed. To verify this, I needed to see how the street actually changed itself, so I started digging up more old maps. Let's start with 1893, just a few years after the first fire map. So while some maps don't show individual addresses, they do reveal how the buildings themselves changed, which would be a reason for an address change. So here in 1893, just a few years after the fire maps, they understandably look pretty much the same. However, I can tell you by this time, this building, which used to share 8 Matthew Street with the center one, was now given its own address. Of course, because 6 Matthew Street already existed to the right, and there were no other numbers in between, this warehouse was split into 2 addresses, 6A and 6B. I know this because I looked it up in the phone book from 1894. Well, technically at this time it was just a directory, and I'll show you more of these later, but these directories are known as Gores and later Kellys. Many are freely available online, and they're kind of the equivalent of what a Yellow Pages was back in the day. The 1900 directory also has 6A and 6B listed alongside regular 6, which sort of proves that these were all separate places at one time. And just for completion's sake again, if you do look at the 1853 directory, like 40 years before, you can see that 8 Matthew Street was actually occupied by 2 businesses because, again, it was 2 giant warehouses sharing one address. The 1908 map is more or less the same, and the same thing goes with the 1927 map. By 1935, though, another change occurs. We can see on our fire map that 6A has now gone away, leaving only 6B for this warehouse. The other major change is that this building to the left, the former 12 and 14 Matthew Street, has now been demolished. This wasn't actually part of Branker's warehouses, but it is the neighboring building. You can see that the electrical substation would soon be expanded here, which at least confirms one thing for our overlay. This border hasn't changed since pre-demolition. On the 1954 map, we get another interesting piece of information. Somebody probably realized that it made no sense to have 6B if 6A no longer existed, so they changed the address of this whole building to 6A. In case this isn't evidence enough, this is why there's confusion about the addresses on this damn street. Following the timeline forward, 1959 looked pretty much the same as well. 1973, the final year before demolition, shows us the final state of Matthew Street. While the addresses remain the same, you'll notice that now the actual 6 Matthew Street has now been demolished as well, along with 4. So contrary to what we thought, the building to the right of the current Cavern Club isn't original. This chunk, which was 6 Matthew Street, was also demolished. We do need to keep this in mind later when we do our overlay. I also want to mention this now, just because the city designated these buildings as these addresses on a map, it doesn't mean that the businesses themselves actually used them or followed this protocol, and you're going to see that in a moment. So these Victorian-era warehouses from 1844 was the original site of the Cavern Club, and these are the same buildings that you would have seen while walking to the entrance in the 1960s to see the Beatles. As for the cellars themselves, nobody really knows if it was from the 1844 construction or dated back even further. Jim Kenny suggests that the cellars may have even been survivors from the original 1816 buildings that had burnt down previously. Either way, those kids in the Cavern Club were partying in rooms that were well over 100 years old. Crazy. Now, while looking at old maps is fun, they're still just drawings. I wanted to see these buildings for real. Looking at photos of the street really wasn't helpful. They almost appear random, with odd misaligned windows and doorways. It was impossible to find out what went where. I needed to find out what these buildings really looked like from above. So I had an idea. Surely aerial photos existed of these buildings. After all, the Germans bombed the shit out of Liverpool during World War II. And I'm really not exaggerating, Liverpool was the most heavily bombed area outside of London, and 4,000 people died during the Liverpool Blitz. And I knew that the Air Force took aerial photos to survey the damage afterwards. I landed on Historic England's Aerial Photo Explorer. That's when I realized that I may have bitten off more than I could chew. There's no address search on these photos. You basically have a rough outline of where they think the airplane took the photo. That's it. Combine this with the fact that I live in Los Angeles and I am not familiar with Liverpool's layout. I began to doubt if I was even looking in the right place. I couldn't see those buildings anywhere. I tried using Google Maps to pinpoint landmarks that are still there today to see where those buildings would have been located in relationship to the city center. Finally, after lots of searching, I found them. When I finally did, it was legitimately almost an emotional experience. There they were, the actual buildings where the Beatles played in. Here they are in June 1941. Wow. At this point, it pretty much became a game of Where's Waldo. I'm telling you, I got so good at finding these f***ing warehouses on a map, I can pick them out from anywhere. So to save time, let's do a montage. That last photo, amazingly, it's from June 1962. And you know what's crazy? The Beatles played the Cavern Club twice that month. When this photo was taken, they could very well be in that building at that moment, preparing for their nightly gig. How insane is that? Historic England's Aerial Photo Explorer also has access to oblique photos, meaning they were taken at an angle rather than a direct overhead flyby. These were even more difficult because north changes direction in pretty much every photo. Luckily, I did the work for you. Here's July 1946. Can you find them? They're right in front of you. Okay, here they are. You can see why I called Matthew Street an alley. It's a narrow, dark connecting road. There's our beautiful warehouses, and just like the fire map, we can see that odd gap on the rightmost building. Here's another photo from July 1946, presumably taken seconds before or after the previous one. Here they are again, and now we actually get to see the face of the buildings. We're now seeing the front side of the warehouses on Harrington Street. As you can see, we can actually make out the loading doors. Curiously, this front building also had a small tower section. This is that fourth story thing that I was talking about on Gode's map. Here's one more angle from July 1946, just for completion's sake. You can see another view of those Victorian-style loading doors. The only other oblique that I was able to find with a decent angle was actually from May 1969. It's not the best shot, but we do get a better view of that tower section. I'm honestly not sure if this was an addition or if it was part of the original buildings. Like I said though, it doesn't show up on the original fire plan. Now that I actually knew what the warehouses looked like, where they were, and what was around them through the years, I could finally start piecing everything together. But there was still something missing. Where was the actual entrance? The literal doorway that you walked in to get into the Cavern Club. That was, after all, the entire point of this video. I started by collecting every street photo I could find of Matthew Street over the years. But like I said, the layout of these buildings was just bizarre. Random changes in window design, broken iron pieces, random doorways. It's nearly impossible to tell where one building ends and the next begins. I needed a better way of mapping out this street.